My name is Thomas Whitfield. I'm 54 years old, and for the past 26 years, I worked as a crematorium operator at Riverside Memorial Crematory in Bettendorf, Iowa, just across the Mississippi River from Davenport. Before that, I spent 18 years as an HVAC technician for a commercial contractor, so I understand combustion systems, industrial equipment, and thermal dynamics. I'm not the type of person who believes in things that can't be measured or explained. I trust machinery, mathematics, and documented procedures. But what I witnessed during my last year at Riverside shattered every certainty I'd built my life upon. And I'm still trying to piece together what remains of my sanity. Let me explain what actually happens inside a crematorium, because most people's understanding comes from movies, and they have no idea what the job really entails. As a crematorium operator, I managed industrial retort systems that operate at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. My responsibilities included receiving deceased individuals from funeral homes throughout the Quad Cities area, verifying identification against documentation, preparing remains for cremation, operating the retort equipment, monitoring the entire cremation cycle, processing the bone fragments into ash, and maintaining detailed records of every single step. It's precise, technical work that demands absolute attention to detail because families are trusting you with their loved ones during the most vulnerable moment of their grief. You handle every case with dignity. You follow protocols without deviation. And you never, ever make a mistake. Riverside Memorial Crematory is located on State Street in Bettendorf, about 1.5 miles from the Mississippi River, in what used to be a light industrial zone before the area started gentrifying. The facility is a low, rectangular building constructed in 1991 with tan brick and minimal windows. We have 3 retort chambers, a large preparation room, administrative offices, a processing area for the cremated remains, and a family viewing room that's almost never used because most families don't want to witness the actual cremation process. We typically handle between 10 and 15 cremations per day, running 2 shifts to meet the demand from funeral homes across Scott County, Rock Island County, and the surrounding communities. I work the evening and overnight shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. most days, with occasional coverage extending to 7 a.m. when we had a backlog. I preferred those hours. The day shift dealt with families, questions, complications. Evening and overnight meant solitude, just me and the machinery and the soft roar of the retorts doing their work. My supervisor was a woman named Rita Holcomb, who'd been in the funeral industry for 30 years. My coworker on rotation was a man named Dennis Kowalski, reliable and methodical. Someone who understood that this job required a certain temperament. You couldn't be squeamish. You couldn't be emotional. You had to treat each case as a professional responsibility and nothing more. The first incident happened on October 12th of last year. I remember the date precisely because it was my daughter Emma's birthday, and I'd promised my wife Laura that I'd be home by midnight for a late celebration after Emma got back from dinner with friends. I arrived at the facility at 2:45 p.m. to find Dennis finishing up his paperwork from a morning cremation. "Anything I should know about?" I asked, setting my lunch bag in the small refrigerator we kept in the office area. Dennis glanced up from his computer. "Standard day. We've got 3 scheduled for your shift. 2 are already prepped in the holding area. The 3rd is coming from Halligan McCabe around 6 p.m. Any issues with the equipment?" Retort 1 had a minor flame sensor error this morning, but I reset it and ran a test cycle. Everything's functioning normally now. After Dennis left, I reviewed the schedule. The first case was an 81-year-old man named Walter Henshaw, who died of complications from pneumonia. The second was a 76-year-old woman named Judith Carmichael who'd passed from a stroke. The third, scheduled for later, was listed only as a pending intake. All routine, all expected deaths. Nothing that should have caused me any concern. I began with Walter Henshaw at 3:30 p.m. I transferred him from the holding refrigeration unit to the preparation table, verified his identification bracelet against the paperwork, removed a watch that the family had missed, and documented everything according to protocol. Mr. Henshaw was dressed in a simple suit that had probably been his church clothes. I transferred him to the cremation container, a sturdy cardboard casket designed to burn completely without residue, wheeled him to retort 2, and initiated the startup sequence. The retort's computer system is sophisticated. It monitors and logs temperature, gas flow, oxygen levels, and burn time. I set the target temperature to 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit, which was appropriate for an individual of his size and body composition. The heavy steel door sealed with a pneumatic hiss. Through the observation window, a thick quartz glass port about 12 inches square, I watched the burners ignite. The flames started low and blue, then built to a roaring orange as the temperature climbed rapidly. The cremation container began to char at around 600 degrees Fahrenheit. By 800 degrees Fahrenheit, it was fully engulfed. Mr. Henshaw's suit ignited quickly, and within 3 minutes, his body was exposed to direct flame. This is the stage where the process becomes visually disturbing if you're not accustomed to it. Soft tissue burns, skin splits and blackens, fluids evaporate with sharp hissing sounds. The smell, despite our ventilation system, is distinct and unpleasant. You learn to breathe through your mouth. I documented the time, 3:47 p.m., and stepped away from the observation window to begin preparing the second case. The Henshaw cremation would take approximately 2.5 hours to complete. Normally, I wouldn't check the observation window again until the cycle was nearly finished, and I needed to verify that the remains were ready for processing. But at 4:23 p.m., I heard something that made me stop in the middle of verifying Judith Carmichael's identification papers. A tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the direction of retort 2. I set down my clipboard and walked slowly back to the observation window. The temperature gauge read 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the flames, I could see Walter Henshaw's body, now partially consumed. The soft tissue on his face and hands was largely gone, exposing bone beneath charred flesh. His rib cage was visible through the burned-away clothing and skin. And his right hand, reduced mostly to skeletal fingers with bits of tendon still attached, was tapping against the floor of the retort chamber. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I stepped back from the window. My first thought was muscle contraction. Heat causes tendons to shrink and tighten, which can produce movement. I'd seen it before, fingers curling, legs shifting slightly. Every crematorium operator sees it eventually. It's a known phenomenon, documented in our training materials. But this was different. This was rhythmic. This was a pattern. I forced myself to look through the observation window again. The skeletal fingers continued their tapping. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The temperature was now 1,425 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, most remaining soft tissue should be burning away. Tendons should be contracting randomly, not producing coordinated patterns. I watched for approximately 40 seconds. The tapping continued, precise and unwavering. Then it stopped abruptly, and Walter Henshaw's skeletal hand lay flat and motionless on the hearth. I sat down at my desk and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Thermal expansion of the retort floor causing vibrations that moved the bones. Pressure differentials in the chamber creating movement. Some mechanical explanation that I wasn't considering because I was tired and because my mind was playing tricks on me after 26 years of doing this work. The temperature reached 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit at 4:51 p.m. I approached the observation window to check the progress, and that's when I saw Walter Henshaw's jaw moving. Not dropping open the way a jaw naturally falls when the muscles burn away. Moving deliberately, opening and closing in a speaking motion, as if he were trying to form words. I stared through the quartz glass, transfixed. His jaw continued to move for approximately 10 seconds, opening and closing with clear intentionality. Then his skull tilted slightly to the left, and though he no longer had eyes, just empty sockets, I had the unmistakable sensation that he was looking at me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my cell phone and called Dennis Kowalski. He answered on the third ring. "Dennis, it's Tom. I need to ask you something about the Henshaw cremation this morning. Did you notice anything unusual during any of your cycles today?" "Unusual how?" Dennis's voice was cautious. "Movement. Like coordinated movement, not just muscle contractions." There was a long pause. "Why are you asking me this, Tom?" "Because I'm watching the Henshaw case right now and I'm seeing movement that doesn't make sense. The jaw opening and closing like he's trying to talk. The hand was tapping earlier in a pattern." Another pause, longer this time. "Tom, you've been doing this job for 26 years. You know that heat causes weird things to happen to bodies. Limbs shift, joints pop, things move around. It's normal." "This isn't normal movement, Dennis. This is purposeful. This is—" "Listen to me," Dennis interrupted, and his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "You finish the cremation. You process the remains. You document everything as routine. And then you go home and get some rest, because you're clearly tired and you're seeing things that aren't there." "But, Tom." His voice was sharp now. "Drop it. You don't want to go down this road. Trust me." He hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, staring at the screen, trying to understand what Dennis had just implied. "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me." As if he knew something. As if he'd seen something too and had chosen to bury it. I walked back to the observation window. The temperature was 1,680 degrees Fahrenheit now, approaching the end of the primary combustion phase. Through the flames, Walter Henshaw's remains were mostly skeletal. His skull had darkened to black. His ribcage had collapsed partially. And as I watched, his skeletal right hand slowly raised up from the hearth, fingers spread wide, palm facing the observation window as if he were pressing against glass trying to get out. The hand remained raised for approximately 7 seconds. Then it lowered back to the hearth and didn't move again. I completed the cremation cycle at 6:15 p.m. After the retort cooled sufficiently, I opened the chamber, swept Walter Henshaw's bone fragments into the processing unit, pulverized them into fine ash, transferred the remains into a temporary urn, labeled it with his name and case number, and documented everything as completely routine in our digital log. Anyone reviewing my records would see nothing unusual about the Walter Henshaw case. But I couldn't stop thinking about that raised hand. I couldn't stop thinking about the jaw moving as if trying to speak, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Dennis had said. "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me." The third case arrived at 6:45 p.m. from Halligan McCabe Funeral Home. The transport driver was a woman named Carol Lindstrom, who'd been making deliveries to our facility for at least a decade. She helped me wheel the body container into the preparation room. "This one's a bit unusual," Carol said as we positioned the container beside my preparation table. "Natural death, but the family requested immediate cremation. No viewing, no service, just cremation and scatter the ashes." "That's not so unusual," I said. "Yeah, but the deceased is young, only 47, woman named Susan Moreland. Died in her sleep from what they're calling sudden cardiac death. No history of heart problems, no warning signs. Just went to bed and didn't wake up." After Carol left, I checked the paperwork. Susan Marie Moreland, aged 47, deceased at her home on Forest Road in Bettendorf. Death certificate signed by Dr. Patricia Chen. Cremation authorization signed by her husband, David Moreland. Everything in order. I transferred Susan Moreland from the transport container to my preparation table. She was a small woman, maybe 5'4", with dark hair cut short. She was dressed in jeans and a blue sweater, casual clothing that suggested the family had wanted her to look natural. Her skin had the waxy, pale appearance of someone who'd been deceased for approximately 48 hours and properly refrigerated. I removed a small silver bracelet from her left wrist and placed it in a labeled envelope for the family. Then I transferred her to the cremation container and began wheeling her toward retort 3, which I preferred for cases involving smaller individuals because it had slightly better temperature control. As I was positioning the container inside the retort chamber, I heard something that made every hair on my arms stand up. A whisper. Soft and barely audible, but unmistakably a voice. "Please." I froze, my hands still gripping the cremation container. The sound had come from directly in front of me, from Susan Moreland. I stared down at her body. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was slightly open, the natural position of a jaw at rest. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was dead, had been dead for 2 days, refrigerated at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with documented cardiac death. "Please don't." The whisper came again, clearer this time. I watched her mouth, and though her lips barely moved, I could see the slight flutter of movement consistent with speech. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart was racing. I'm 54 years old, and I take blood pressure medication. And standing there in that retort chamber, I became acutely aware of every irregular beat of my heart. "You're not real," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "This isn't real. You're dead. You've been dead for 2 days. I'm still here." The whisper was so faint I had to strain to hear it. "I'm trapped. Please help me. Please don't burn me." I backed out of the retort chamber completely, my hands trembling. This wasn't possible. This violated everything I understood about death, about brain function, about the absolute finality of mortality. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. That's medical fact. That's scientific certainty. I pulled out my phone and called Rita Holcomb, my supervisor. She answered immediately. "Rita, I need to speak with you about something urgent. Can you come to the facility?" "Tom, I'm in the middle of a meeting with the Thompson family. Can it wait until tomorrow?" "No, it can't wait. I need you here now." There must have been something in my voice that alarmed her, because her tone changed immediately. "What happened? Is there an equipment problem?" "I don't know how to explain it. Please, just come here. I'll wait for you." She arrived 37 minutes later. I met her at the entrance and led her back to retort 3, where Susan Moreland's body still lay in the cremation container, positioned half inside the chamber. "Talk to me, Tom," Rita said, studying my face with concern. "What's going on?" "Watch her," I said, pointing at Susan Moreland's body. "Just watch and listen." We stood there in silence for approximately 90 seconds. Susan Moreland didn't move. She didn't speak. She lay motionless in the cremation container, exactly as a deceased person should. "Tom," Rita said gently, "what exactly am I supposed to be seeing?" She was talking. I heard her whisper. She said, "Please don't," and "help me," and that she was trapped. Rita's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like pity. "Tom, you've been working here for 26 years. You know that bodies don't talk. Sometimes air escapes from the lungs during handling, and it can make sounds. Sometimes. This wasn't air escaping. This was words. This was speech." Rita put her hand on my shoulder. "I think you need to take a few days off. You've been working too many hours, and this job can get to anyone after enough years. The isolation, the nature of the work, it wears you down even when you don't realize it." "I'm not having a breakdown," I said. Though even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Something is wrong here, Rita. Something is happening during cremations that we don't understand. "Tom." Her voice was firm now. "I need you to finish this case, document it as routine, and then go home. We'll talk about scheduling some time off tomorrow." She left before I could argue further. I stood alone in the retort room, staring at Susan Moreland's body. The whispers had stopped. She lay motionless and silent. Everything Rita said made logical sense. Air escaping from the lungs. Auditory hallucinations from stress and fatigue. The mind playing tricks after too many years of working in a crematorium. But I knew what I'd heard. And I knew what I'd seen with Walter Henshaw earlier that day. I started the cremation cycle at 8:30 p.m. I set the temperature to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, closed and sealed the chamber door, and ignited the burners through the observation window. I watched the flames build. Watched the cremation container begin to char. Watched Susan Moreland's body slowly exposed to direct heat. At 8:47 p.m., when the temperature reached 920 degrees Fahrenheit, I heard her voice clearly through the roar of the flames. "Thomas, please. It hurts." My name. She said my name. How could she know my name? She was a stranger. She'd died before ever coming to this facility. There was no way she could know who I was. I approached the observation window and looked inside. The temperature was 1,040 degrees Fahrenheit. Susan Moreland's clothing was burning away. Her skin was beginning to char and split. And her eyes, which had been closed when I loaded her into the chamber, were now open, staring directly at the observation window. Staring directly at me. I watched in horror as her charred lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the roar of the flames but could clearly see. "Help! Me!" Her right hand lifted from the hearth, not a spasm, not a random muscle contraction, but a slow, controlled movement. She reached toward the observation window, her blackening fingers spread wide, and pressed her palm against the interior of the door, as if she were trying to push through the steel to reach me. The temperature gauge read 1,180 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, nerve tissue should be destroyed almost instantly. Pain receptors should be long gone. Consciousness should be impossible. But Susan Moreland's eyes remained open, locked on mine through the observation window. Her mouth continued to move, forming the same words over and over. "Help me. Help me. Help me." I couldn't watch anymore. I walked back to my desk and sat down, my hands clasped over my ears as if that could block out what I'd seen. The retort roared behind me. I could smell the distinctive odor of burning human tissue even through our ventilation system. And underneath the mechanical sounds, I could hear something that might have been screaming or might have been the metal components expanding in the heat. At 1,520 degrees Fahrenheit, I heard my name again. "Thomas, please!" I didn't turn around. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to focus on anything except the voice calling to me from inside the retort. "Thomas, I'm burning. I'm still here. I can feel everything. Please help me. Please make it stop." The voice was clearer now, rising above the roar of the flames. Not a whisper anymore, but something closer to speech, thin and desperate and utterly impossible. I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the exit. I couldn't stay in that building. I couldn't listen to Susan Moreland screaming my name while her body burned at temperatures hot enough to liquefy bone. But I stopped at the door. Because if I left now, if I abandoned the cremation cycle, what would happen? Would she remain conscious throughout the entire process? Would she experience hours of burning, trapped in a body that couldn't die quickly enough? The thought was unbearable. I walked back to the observation window. The temperature was 1,640 degrees Fahrenheit, approaching the peak of the cremation cycle. Through the flames, I could see Susan Moreland's remains, now mostly skeletal with some charred flesh still adhering to the bones. Her skull was blackened, her jaw hanging open in what looked like a silent scream. And as I watched, her skeletal hand reached up one final time, fingers trembling, and then collapsed back to the hearth and didn't move again. The cycle completed at 11:04 p.m. I processed Susan Moreland's remains according to exact protocol, documenting everything as routine. Then I locked the facility and drove home in complete silence, unable to turn on the radio because any sound felt like too much after what I'd just experienced. Laura was still awake when I got home, reading in bed. "You're late," she said, glancing at the clock. "Everything okay?" "Long day," I managed. "Equipment issues." She studied my face. "Tom, you look terrible. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine. Just tired." But I wasn't fine. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying what I'd heard and seen. By dawn, I'd convinced myself that Rita was right. I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, stress-induced hallucinations, auditory disturbances from years of exposure to industrial noise. Something explainable, something treatable. The next morning, I called Rita and told her I was taking her advice about time off. She seemed relieved and arranged for Dennis to cover my shifts for the next 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I tried to convince myself that everything I'd experienced had been in my head. I spent time with Laura, visited my daughter Emma, worked in the garden, read books, watched television. Normal life. Normal activities. But at night, I still heard Susan Moreland's voice calling my name. On my first day back at Riverside Memorial, Dennis pulled me aside before his shift ended. "Tom, we need to talk." "About what?" He glanced toward Rita's office, making sure her door was closed. "About what you saw, what you heard, during the Henshaw and Moreland cremations." My heart started racing. "Dennis, I've seen it too," he said quietly. I didn't want to say anything on the phone because I was afraid someone might be listening. "But I've seen it, Tom. 3 times over the past 4 years. Bodies moving in ways that aren't possible. Mouths forming words. Eyes opening. And voices. God, the voices." I stared at him, feeling a mixture of relief and fresh terror. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you report it?" "Report it to who? Rita? She'd think I was crazy. Corporate? They'd fire me for mental instability. And what would I even say? That dead people are somehow conscious during cremation? That they can feel the burning? Nobody would believe it. Hell, I don't believe it. And I've seen it with my own eyes." "But if it's happening," I said, "if this is real, then we're torturing people. We're burning them alive somehow. They're already dead, Tom. Medical professionals certified them as dead. Their hearts aren't beating. They're not breathing. By every scientific measure, they're deceased. But something remains. Some part of consciousness or awareness or soul, if you believe in that. And for some reason, during the cremation process, whatever that something is can still experience what's happening to the body. That's not possible. The brain dies when oxygen stops flowing. Consciousness ends. That's neuroscience. I know what neuroscience says. I've read the same articles you probably have. But what we're seeing contradicts all of that. And Tom, I've checked the records going back 15 years. There are notes from other operators, brief mentions of unusual movement or strange sounds during cremations. It's been happening for years, maybe decades. But nobody wants to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would mean confronting something that science says shouldn't exist. I thought about that for a moment. How often does it happen? Does every cremation? No. Maybe 1 in every 100, maybe fewer. Most cremations proceed exactly as expected. No anomalies, nothing unusual. But when it does happen, it's unmistakable. You know you're seeing something that shouldn't be possible. "We have to do something," I said. "We can't just keep operating as if this isn't happening." Dennis shook his head. "What can we do? Stop cremating people? That's not an option. families choose cremation. We're providing a service. And the alternative is burial, which has its own problems. At least with cremation, whatever consciousness or awareness exists is only experiencing it for 2 or 3 hours at most. Burial means being trapped in a coffin underground, potentially aware for how long? Weeks, months, until the body fully decomposes? The thought made me feel sick. I just wanted you to know you're not crazy, Dennis continued. What you saw was real. I saw it too. Others have seen it. But we have to keep doing our jobs, Tom. We have to keep maintaining our equipment and processing these cases because the alternative is worse. That conversation changed everything for me. Knowing I wasn't experiencing hallucinations should have been a relief, but instead it made everything worse. Because if what we were witnessing was real, then every cremation carried the terrible possibility that the deceased person might somehow remain aware during the process. Over the next 6 months, I performed approximately 300 cremations. Most proceeded exactly as expected. No anomalies, no movement beyond normal heat-induced muscle contractions. But 7 cases were different. The first was a 62-year-old man named Kevin Braddock who died of liver failure. At 1,450 degrees Fahrenheit, his skeletal fingers began drumming against the hearth in a clear, rhythmic pattern that lasted for 43 seconds. The second was an 83-year-old woman named Margaret Hines, who died in a nursing home. At 1,380 degrees Fahrenheit, her jaw began moving in what looked exactly like speech. And though I couldn't hear words over the roar of the flames, I could read her lips forming the same phrase repeatedly. Let me go. The third was a 71-year-old man named Arthur Dennison, who died of complications from diabetes. At 1,550 degrees Fahrenheit, his entire skeletal rib cage expanded and contracted 3 times in a perfect breathing motion, as if he were trying to draw air into lungs that no longer existed. The fourth was a 58-year-old woman named Claire Patterson, who died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. At 1,620 degrees Fahrenheit, she spoke my name clearly enough that I heard it over the equipment noise. Thomas. Thomas, please. The fifth was a 66-year-old man named Raymond Carter, who died of heart disease. At 1,490 degrees Fahrenheit, his skeletal hand reached toward the observation window and remained extended for 72 seconds before finally dropping back to the hearth. The sixth was a 79-year-old woman named Beatrice Sullivan, who died of natural causes at home. At 1,580 degrees Fahrenheit, her skull rotated on her cervical vertebrae to face the observation window directly, and her empty eye sockets seemed to stare at me for almost 2 minutes. The seventh was a 44-year-old man named Michael Torres who died in a car accident. At 1,670 degrees Fahrenheit, his entire body shifted position inside the retort, rolling from his back onto his right side as if he were trying to get up, trying to escape the flames. I documented each case as completely routine, not because I wanted to hide what was happening, but because I knew that reporting these incidents would accomplish nothing except destroying my career and credibility. Who would believe me? What investigation could possibly prove what I was witnessing? The bodies were reduced to ash afterward. There was no evidence, no proof, nothing except my testimony, which any rational person would dismiss as stress-induced hallucination or early-onset dementia. But the experiences were accumulating, weighing on me, making it harder and harder to function normally. I started having nightmares about burning alive, about being conscious but unable to move or scream while flames consumed my body. I woke up several times a week, drenched in sweat, Laura shaking my shoulder, asking if I was okay. I wasn't okay. Nothing about any of this was okay. In late April, I started researching the historical records of Riverside Memorial. The facility had been operating since 1991, which meant 33 years of cremations, thousands and thousands of cases. I requested access to the archived records, telling Rita I was interested in tracking equipment maintenance patterns to optimize our current procedures. It took me 3 weeks to go through everything, but what I found confirmed what Dennis had told me. Brief notations appeared throughout the records, scattered across different operators and different years. Unusual movement observed. Possible equipment malfunction during cycle. Strange sounds from chamber. Recommend maintenance inspection. The maintenance inspections always found nothing wrong with the equipment. The notations went back to 1993, just 2 years after the facility opened. For 31 years, operators at Riverside Memorial had been witnessing the same impossible phenomena I was experiencing. But nobody had ever reported it officially, nobody had ever investigated it thoroughly, and nobody had ever acknowledged the horrifying implication of what we were all seeing. I found one set of notes that particularly disturbed me. They were from an operator named Patricia Schroeder, who'd worked at Riverside from 1998 to 2003. Over her 5-year employment, she documented 7 cases with unusual movement or sounds. Her final note, dated 3 days before her resignation, simply said, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep burning people who might still be aware. This job is destroying me." I tried to track down Patricia Schroeder, but she'd moved out of state and I couldn't find current contact information. I did find her obituary, though. She'd died in 2011 at age 49 from what was listed as suicide. Pills and alcohol in her home in Denver, Colorado. That discovery shook me badly, because I understood exactly what had driven Patricia Schroeder to leave this profession, and I could imagine how the weight of what she'd witnessed might have haunted her for years afterward, eventually becoming unbearable. I was heading in that same direction. I could feel it, the constant anxiety, the nightmares, the inability to stop thinking about what might be happening to people during cremation. Laura noticed I was drinking more. Emma commented that I seemed distant during our weekly phone calls. I was losing weight because food had stopped tasting like anything. On May 17th, I processed a case that finally broke me completely. The deceased was a 7-year-old girl named Sophie Chen who died from complications of leukemia. The family had chosen cremation, which is less common for children, but they'd specifically requested it and all the paperwork was in order. I prepared Sophie with extra care, as I always did with children's cases. She was dressed in pink pajamas decorated with cartoon unicorns. Her parents had included a small stuffed rabbit that would burn with her. She looked like she was sleeping, peaceful and innocent. I loaded her into retort 1 and started the cremation cycle at 4:15 p.m. I set a lower temperature, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is standard for children because they require less heat for complete cremation. At 4:41 p.m., when the temperature reached 890 degrees Fahrenheit, I heard her voice. "Mommy?" The single word, small and frightened and utterly heartbreaking. I stood frozen at my desk, unable to move, unable to breathe. This was a child. A 7-year-old child who'd already suffered through cancer and painful treatments and finally death. And somehow, impossibly, she was aware during the cremation, experiencing the burning, calling for her mother. "Mommy, it hurts. Mommy, please help me." I ran to the observation window. Through the flames, I could see Sophie's small body. Her pajamas were burning away. Her skin was beginning to char, and her mouth was moving, forming words, calling for her mother while her body was consumed by 900-degree flames. I hit the emergency shutdown button without thinking. The burners cut off immediately. The temperature began to drop slowly as the chamber started cooling, but I could still see Sophie through the observation window, her partially burned body lying in the cremation container, and I could still hear her voice, fainter now but still present. Mommy, I'm scared." I don't remember making the conscious decision to open the chamber door. I just remember grabbing the emergency override controls, bypassing the safety interlocks and pulling the heavy steel door open despite the dangerous temperature inside. Heat blasted out, singing the hair on my arms. Warning alarms started blaring throughout the facility. But I reached into the chamber, grabbed the cremation container by its handles, and pulled Sophie Chen's partially cremated body out of the retort. Her voice stopped immediately. The moment I removed her from the chamber, whatever awareness or consciousness she'd been experiencing seemed to end. She lay motionless in the cremation container, a small body partially consumed by fire, mercifully silent. I stood there holding the container, alarms shrieking around me, not knowing what to do next. Rita arrived 16 minutes later, summoned by the automated alarm system. She found me sitting on the floor next to Sophie Chen's body, my hands badly burned from pulling the hot container out of the chamber. Tom. Her voice was carefully controlled, the way people talk when they're trying not to panic. Tom, what happened here? She was aware, I said dully. She was calling for her mother. I could hear her voice. She said it hurt, and she was scared and she wanted her mommy. Rita's expression shifted from shock to deep concern. Tom, you need medical attention for your hands. And then we need to have a serious conversation about your mental health and your continued employment here. She called an ambulance. While we waited, she gently took my phone and called Laura, explaining that I'd had an incident at work and needed to be taken to the hospital. She didn't mention what I'd said about hearing Sophie Chen's voice. The EMTs treated me for second-degree burns on both hands and forearms, wrapped them tightly, and loaded me into the ambulance. I remember the strobing interior lights, the antiseptic smell, and the medic asking me basic orientation questions. My name, the date, where I was. I answered automatically, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, but in my mind I was still hearing Sophie's voice, those small, terrified words echoing through me like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. At Genesis East in Davenport, they admitted me overnight for observation due to shock. Laura arrived less than an hour later, her face pale and frightened as she clasped my unbandaged arm. What happened? She asked. I made a mistake at work, I said. It was the only version of the truth I could give her without destroying her. Tom, a mistake doesn't leave burns like these. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even look her in the eyes. Every time I tried, I saw the retort chamber reflected there. Red, burning, hungry. The hospital psychiatrist visited the next morning. Middle-aged man, kind eyes, soft voice, trained to detect cracks in people like me. He asked if I'd been hallucinating. He asked if I was stressed, depressed, sleep-deprived. He asked if I'd been hearing voices outside of work. I lied because I knew telling him the truth would lead to psychiatric holds, mandatory evaluations, medications that would fog my thoughts. I needed my mind clear to make sense of what was happening. I needed to finish connecting the patterns Dennis and I had only glimpsed. I was released the next afternoon with prescriptions for pain and infection prevention, plus a recommendation to take medical leave from work. Rita called that evening. Her voice was cautious, measured. Tom, I've spoken to corporate. They're putting you on mandatory leave pending an internal review. An internal review of what? I asked. Your decision to override the safety interlocks, to open a chamber at unsafe temperature, to remove a case mid-cycle. A pause. Tom, what you did could have killed you. I didn't answer because I knew she was right, but I also knew something she didn't. Something no administrative panel or corporate inquiry would ever want to hear. I'd saved that little girl from burning alive. Not physically. Her body had already undergone irreversible thermal trauma. But whatever part of her had remained aware. I had ended that suffering. Whether anyone else believed me no longer mattered. 3 nights later, at 2:14 a.m., someone knocked on my front door. I was awake, sitting in the dark living room because sleep had become impossible. The knock was soft but deliberate. Knuckles against wood, 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. Exactly the same pattern I'd heard from Walter Henshaw's hand inside retort 2. My skin crawled. I opened the door because part of me needed to know. Dennis stood on the porch. He looked terrible. Eyes bloodshot, hair disheveled, face gaunt like he hadn't slept in days. He stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it behind him before I could say a word. "We don't have much time," he said. "For what?" "For the truth." His voice trembled. "Tom, they came to my house." My breath caught. "Who?" "Corporate. Not Rita. Not our local people. Someone higher up. Someone from the parent conglomerate. They said they were conducting a wellness check." He swallowed. "But they asked questions about the anomalies, about movement, about voices. They asked if I'd ever noticed anything during cycles." A chill slid down my spine. "What did you tell them?" "What do you think?" he said bitterly. "I told them no, that I'd never seen anything unusual in 20 years. He sank onto my couch, rubbing his hands over his face. But that wasn't the scary part. Then what was? He looked up at me with hollow eyes. They weren't surprised by the questions. They were recording my answers, sure, but they weren't listening. They already knew what I'd say. They already knew what I'd seen." My stomach tightened. "You're saying they know about all of it?" Dennis nodded slowly. "They've known for decades." I sat down across from him. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means the anomalies aren't rare accidents. They aren't 1 in 100 events. They're predictable. They follow patterns. They occur more frequently under certain conditions. Temperature ranges, certain durations after death, specific medical histories. And Riverside is one of several facilities where they track these occurrences." I felt the room tilt slightly, as if gravity itself had shifted. "Track them? For what purpose?" I asked. Dennis's voice dropped to a whisper. "For research." The word hit me like a blow. "No," I said immediately. "Dennis, no. That's insane." "Is it?" he whispered. "You think our retorts are standard? You think those computer systems came from some generic industrial vendor?" "Tom, our cremators have proprietary modifications. Corporate installed them years ago. Extra thermal sensors, audio pickups in the fire brick, unlisted data ports behind the access panels. I didn't understand any of it until now." He leaned closer. "They're studying whatever persists after death." My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear his words. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that corporate knows people remain aware during cremation? That they expect it?" "They're not sure if it's awareness," Dennis said. "They call it residual activity, but they're documenting it, recording it, sampling it." "How do you know this?" I demanded. His answer made my blood run cold. "Because one of the corporate investigators dropped a folder on my kitchen table by accident." He reached into his coat and pulled out several pages. The paper was thick, high-quality stock, the kind used for confidential documents. He handed them to me. The pages weren't written in funeral home terminology. They were written like scientific research. Data log: residual phenomenological responses during thermal reclamation. Correlation metrics: auditory output, structured musculoskeletal signaling, vocal pattern formation. Cycle 4 to 17A. Subject SC. Age 7. My vision tunneled. SC Sophie Chen. I scanned the entry beneath. Observation: subject displayed spontaneous autonomous vocalization at ignition threshold approximately 870 to 930 degrees Fahrenheit. PHR, post-harvest response. Patterns consistent with type 3 activity, volitional distress output. Cycle prematurely terminated by operator TW. There were timestamps, thermal readings, audio spikes. A note in the margin: confirm emotional recognition loop. My hands began to shake violently. "They monitored her," I whispered. "They were recording her.